Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Green Scare Podcast. So, today we have a very special guest, award winning investigative journalist and public speaker Will Potter. So, Will's going to be joining us to talk about his new book, Little Red Barns, as well as giving us insight into his past experiences investigating the Green Scare and government repression. And the interesting thing is, Will actually coined the term Green Scare. So, special guest indeed. So, Will, to start off with, how's your Twilight fan club in Washington, D.C. going?
Well, it's good to be here, and I appreciate you still remember the Twilight trolling from Daniel McGowan back in the day. It's going well, man. It's going strong. There's a lot of things otherwise going on in DC right now. It's not getting the attention it deserves, but we'll bounce back.
Oh, dang, it's a tumultuous time. It's a tumultuous time, and I really do appreciate you being here. Oh, it's great. So, I know that. What actually got you interested at first in activism and journalism?
Well, I started working in newspapers when I was 17. I first started in high school, and I got my first job at the division of the Dallas Morning News, still as a teenager. And when I went to undergrad at University of Texas at Austin, it was still with that intention. I went to journalism school. I started working at the newspaper, Texas Observer, the radio station, but also got really pulled into that culture, especially in Austin at the time in the mid 90s, of there's a lot of activism taking place. For me, it was first against the economic sanctions in Iraq, and then that spread to environmental activism. And from there, friends exposed me really through punk and hardcore as well to animal rights activism.
Yeah, I know. There's a quote from you on the Wikipedia page for animal rights and punk rock, which says to understand a little bit about the hardcore animal rights scene. It helps to learn a little bit about punk rock. I think you really hit the nail on the head there because that's actually how I got involved in this kind of activism as well, environmentalism, animal rights. So, how did you get involved specifically in journalism covering, the environmental repression you would later call the Green Scare?
It was really around that time. I had this kind of parallel interest in my life that really have continued to this day of pursuing journalism, but also caring deeply about these social issues. Um, and so I started to combine them when I was still in college. I got a grant to write for the Texas Observer, which is an old muckraking magazine there in Austin. And the first story I wrote about these attacks on protest was actually scheduled to be published the week of the September 11th attacks, and it was. So we had it all ready to go, and I was kind of identifying these trends, and then 9/11 happened, and of course things radically accelerated. So for me, that's where some of those first usage of that terminology and this comparison to the Red Scare and to previous eras of repression was all in that article I was writing for the Texas Observer. And then from there, it kind of just it ramped up so quickly. And I've been really public. I had my own experiences, with the FBI that when I was writing for the Chicago Tribune, that further kind of solidified that path and pointed me further in that direction.
All right, yeah. So, what was going through your mind when you first heard about, these activists that you were covering being called domestic terrorists?
It was a mix of like, I can't believe people are actually trying to do this. For instance, at that time in that Texas Observer article, I wrote about a young woman named Megan who was protesting outside of First Stores in Dallas. She had just been doing nonviolent civil disobedience. There's other people like Mike Brazell, longtime environmental activists, and others that I talk about in that piece that I really couldn't at the time I couldn't process like how this was happening, where that terrorism language came from. Um, Remember leading up to that, like especially in the 1980s through the 90s in the United States, that language of terrorism was mostly about things like, plane hijackings and bombings and sending chemical weapons and militia attacks. We have Waco in Texas, the Branch Davidian assault by the government. And so to hear it being directly used to activists who were not even accused of anything like property destruction or sabotage was really alarming. And the more I dug into that, even at that early stage, I was really convinced that this is the trajectory. This is going to be accelerating rapidly because corporations are going to see this as a way to shut down protest. And that's exactly what has happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember that Rod Coronado, I believe, the judge at his trial compared him to the Oklahoma City bombers, and it's just how could you do
Yep.
that? I mean, how disrespectful is it to the families of those victims, to the victims themselves, to the victims of any kind of crime to compare simple property destruction to that? I can understand with those things being in such recent memory how that would have been especially shocking and insulting.
Well, and particularly, I talked to Rod at that time. He had a few court cases going on. Um, and, one of the things he said that really struck me, that particularly as an indigenous person, I mean, the audacity of the US government saying that someone who has that background speaking up and acting in defense of the environment and animals and their sovereignty is a threat to national security is just kind of this upside down narrative that's happened in the United States for many years.
Yeah. So, how would you explain the Green Scare to people who have never heard of it, which, let's face it, is the majority of the population? And what do you think that the general public frequently misunderstands about animal rights and environmental activists, specifically the radical kind?
Yeah, so the Green Scare is making a comparison to what I hope most Americans have still some idea of the Red Scare, both of the 1920s, but specifically the 1940s and 50s. We think about McCarthyism, right? People's lives were ruined, fired from university positions and from their jobs. There were the blacklists. This language of communism was used to instill fear in the public and really used as a weapon to wrap up all types of different left and progressive causes under that banner in the name of criminalizing them and shutting down protest. And so as I got more and more involved in this work, I started seeing not just similarities, but what I would argue is the exact same playbook, beginning with that power of language. And with the Green Scare, it was not about communism. It was about labeling activists as eco-terrorists, which is a term that the industry literally just invented in the mid 1980s in order to do this, to shut down the environmental movement that was growing. And I think what most people don't know about all of this is that for many years, the FBI's stated number one domestic terrorism threat were these movements, environmentalism and animal rights activism. They never harmed a human being. They weren't hijacking planes. They weren't killing people. They weren't sending anthrax or anything like that. And I think that's still so important to emphasize to people. One, because these tactics are continuing, but also because through that whole period, the FBI was told repeatedly by Congress and by the Inspector General's office that focusing on nonviolent activists would allow right-wing violence to grow unchecked. And that's exactly what's happened. And so I would argue a lot of this current situation that, the word situation is interesting. The rise of fascism that we're seeing right now in the United States, January 6th,
The
the
current
Trump,
apocalypse, the current atrocity.
the current atrocity of authoritarianism, a surge in right-wing violence, neo-Nazis marching through the streets, avowed white supremacists in the Capitol Rotunda, and now in the White House. I think it's all directly connected to that. The FBI was enabling these far right groups for many years by giving them a blank check. And now we see the consequences of that.
Absolutely. So, what have your personal experiences been with FBI repression, stalking, and harassment? I mean, I've had the FBI show up at my door pretty much because of something that I posted online, which they said was constitutionally protected. And I know what I post online and saying, like, oh, we investigate every case, but we know they don't. And we know that, this is just part of, like, I guess, repression, et cetera. Like, yeah, what have your personal experiences like that been?
In comparison to the people I've written about and the activists who've been sentenced not just to prison, but to experimental prison units to enhance security measures and things like that, my experience has been quite mild. I was visited by the FBI, who threatened to put me on a domestic terrorist list just a few months after September 11th. And particularly at that time, in that era, when you're seeing this language of terrorism ramping up and this kind of, frankly, what felt like a bloodlust in this country. You had football stadiums full of people cheering when it was announced like we're bombing Afghanistan and Iraq, right? Like there's this national fervor. So it was really chilling. And so I've spoken a lot about this idea of the chilling effect, which is when the FBI comes knocking like that, one of the consequences could be like direct on your life. They're really trying to screw up. And they made these threats to me about grants and a Fulbright I had pending and my career and my girlfriend's career. And they threatened to kind of screw all that up. But you don't know what's going to happen. And that fear has always been the primary weapon in state repression. Because frankly, these government agencies don't have the power or the bodies to go after and visit everyone and harass everyone and monitor every journalist and every protester. But they can make them afraid, and that fear spreads. And as my career went on, there've been a number of instances where I found my reporting has been cited in court cases, trying to argue that defendants were connected to me as an extremist. Through open records requests, I've gotten documents from the counterterrorism unit about my speeches and correspondence, my articles, people I'm associating with. Outside of government harassment, a couple of years ago, I had some quite chilling run-ins with white supremacist groups that were threatening violence. And so it's kind of this whole mix of strategies and harassment that, for me, less than, each of those incidents had an impact. And I've tried to be really vocal and kind of normalize that we need to talk about this stuff. But there's also a danger of just like the cumulative impact of seeing this happen to all these different people, these threats against me, not really knowing, are you safe, are you not? And personally speaking, I feel like that's been the most destabilizing. Just not knowing and having that fear seep in.
Yeah. So, in the face of that fear, what is it that keeps you motivated to keep speaking out?
It's hard to answer that question because I don't feel like it's something I actively even think about. It feels like it is just so much the path, and I feel that way in a lot of activists and journalists and others that I've spoken with. Um, it's kind of a path that you're on that, as I tell my journalism students, you have to write the stories that if you don't, you'll feel like it'll kind of burn you up inside. And that's how I felt about this work, especially when that FBI visit happened in Chicago. It took me a little bit of time to process that. Like I moved to DC afterwards. I was covering Congress. I was part of I covered the Supreme Court. I was part of the Congressional Press Corps. I kept on this very kind of mainstream path, but I knew it was inevitable that I had to confront this fact that this is what I'm supposed to do. This is what like my heart is telling me to speak out about. And I've stayed with this work because I want to believe that I'm contributing something kind of unique in that space based on my experience, both as a journalist and having connections to these movements that I think other journalists have frankly missed. So that's why I continue doing it.
What advice would you give to young people who want to write or speak about activism today?
It's tough. I think it's easy in conversations like this with an author or with some older activists, kind of realizing I'm getting older now. It's tempting to view other people's lives like they had a very linear or clear-cut path. And I think the first thing I would say is that it never works out that way. So whatever uncertainty and kind of chaos or decisions that you're facing and you're feeling a tension of like, how do I make this work? How do I live by my values? How do I fight for these issues while also paying my bills or, maintaining relationships? my first thing would be to say that's all completely valid and normal, and it's never as straightforward as it might look when you look at other people's lives. More broadly, though, the way I've kind of been thinking about a lot of things lately is really 2 points. One, I think we need younger folks, particularly, to recognize that we're in struggles that are very well going to continue the rest of our lives. The ecological crisis and the rise of fascism, in particular, globally, are not going away anytime soon. And in fact, they're accelerating. And I think what's most important is that we really internalize that and try to set ourselves up to be the type of people that are engaged in this work, in this art, this struggle over very long periods of time. And I say that because, I'm in my mid 40s now. You see people come and go, and that's connected to burnout and fear and activist politics and infighting and all kinds of things. But the more we can kind of have that headspace of we need to sustain this for a long time to keep fighting, I think is really important. And the second part of that is, I guess personally right now, I'm trying to view each of us as historical agents, right? To view this moment that we're in as a historic kind of turning point in history. And that doesn't mean kind of patting ourselves on the back as, Dr. King or MLK or, any of these like kind of heroic figures, but it's just realizing we're in moments that people later are going to look back on and wonder what the hell we did and look to us for answers. Just like we look to people from the 60s, 70s, 80s, lessons in their lives. And so to me, that's kind of a liberating thing to say that
We're
the
writing history.
situation, we are writing history, and we
Right.
can do that without arrogance, right? But just to accept the fact that, like, yeah, what we're doing right now is that significant. It doesn't feel that way because of the onslaught,
Never
right?
does. But yeah.
But if you look at these other eras and you study them throughout history, it never looks that way. Um, James Baldwin once said that love has never been a popular movement. And I think what he was really saying was that kind of radical politics and fighting for social change has never been a popular movement. It's never been like everyone on board. It's always little clusters of people. And I think if we recognize that, it can really sustain us.
Absolutely. And, just speaking about the repression and the things you've covered, you're one of the very few activists who have seen the inside of a CMU, a communications management unit. So, what was that experience like for you personally, and how did it shape your understanding of the prison system and political repression in the United States?
Yeah, so as for folks who don't know, these communications management units or CMUs were opened after 9/11 as a way of isolating and segregating prisoners who were deemed to have, quote, inspirational significance, or in other words, be political prisoners. They overwhelmingly housed Muslim prisoners after 9/11, of course. Then they were expanded to some environmentalists and animal rights activists, and now they also include some right wing, kind of like anti government tax militia types like that. I visited Daniel McGowan, an Earth Liberation Front prisoner. Frankly, I didn't think I was going to get approved. I mean, when Daniel and I were corresponding, um, he put in the request. I had to fill out all the information about me. I thought there was just no way in hell they would allow something like this. And it was interesting that they did. Um, and then when I got to the prison, the guards and others made very clear, like, we know exactly who you are. We know all kinds of details about who you are. And we're going to closely monitor this, not to punish you or me necessarily, but to punish Daniel McGowan if I did anything that ran afoul. So I thought that kind of surprised me in how clever that approach was. And the way I handled it is we just had a normal conversation. I kind of knew a lot of the details of the CMUs already. So we just talked about daily life. And I think what really stayed with me most about that were some of the conversations with Daniel about the disconnect from his partner and his niece in his community. And I've heard this from every prisoner I've ever interviewed and any former prisoner. I mean, those contacts with the outside world are absolute lifelines. I mean, letters, phone calls, visits, they are what sustain someone in those really extreme conditions. And the CMUs are so cruel, and I would argue a violation of human rights law because they fly in the face of that. They deliberately separate people from their communities to punish them for that, but they also separate them from their families, their friends, their wives and kids, and just seeing the toll and hearing the toll that that takes on people really lingered with me.
Do you see
I,
similarities between? Sorry, continue.
well, I was just going to say, even as I said that, I think what also I carried forward is going back to that historic conversation. It's okay, these exist right now. This is not something that was opened during the Red Scare and now we realized is a mistake where the government went too far. Like these mistakes are being repeated. And that was really chilling to me of seeing this extreme government overreach and government power being applied to repress movements right now as I'm seeing it real time, if that makes sense. There's these been like these kind of a disconnect at different times. I guess I've been dissociating a lot throughout my career, frankly, as well, of not realizing like, okay, what's happening right now is it is that bad. It is that scary. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing that we'd expect to be reading about. We'd expect for, future generations to be reading about in the history books. But I mean, just at the state we're in, who knows if like we're even gonna have history books written in the future, let alone what they're
100%.
gonna say, right?
Yeah, how long? I may have been thinking that on book tour right now, speaking at universities. How many more lectures do we have like this, where an anti-fascist investigative journalist is able to give public lectures warning about this authoritarian threat and publish books about it? I mean that as a serious question to folks who are watching right now. Like, how much time do you think we have left before they start going after things like that? I mean, we're already seeing it with Gaza. We're already seeing tenured professors under attack, books, media outlets. So yeah, it's realizing that we're here.
Yeah, I think just seeing the apathy from the general public has been, the most shocking thing to me. I mean, there are, significant populations of the there are significant segments of the population who care, like it's not like we're
Sure.
completely alone on this. But if you look at the public by and large, people just don't seem to mind, and you really get a sense of how atrocities can just happen while the general public, just, pays no mind to it. I was going to ask, do you see similarities? And it's always hard to quantify or equate things, but at least do you see structural similarities between the prison industrial complex and the animal industrial complex?
Yeah, and that's really where my recent book went. And in some ways that started with those prison visits. And one of the things I noticed was that, I'm doing factory farm investigations around the same time. I'm also, visiting activists in prison, or I'm doing that type of reporting. And there's a lot of similarity between a prison town and a factory farm town. And that's one of the first things that started really to gel, that comparison, is that these are entrapped communities, where the need to just have a job with any industry that's there really is controlling the entire community, and people feel kind of bound to it. And that's what you see on factory farms as well. But then if you look at the actual structures of control and the systems and how they're designed, it's not just a metaphorical comparison of imprisoned humans and imprisoned animals. I mean, I want to be very clear that in the course of researching Littlewood Barns, I found that these systems are directly interlocked. So, for instance, some of the research about how prison walls are painted certain colors, that came out of trying to subdue animals on the way to the kill floor. the technology that's being used to monitor migrants, the kind of GPS tracking and devices used for prisoners and former prisoners, the top company in that business started with cattle. And then in one article I found, the president of the company said that they went from cows to cons because they saw money. Of course, we can expand this to a little bit more of a theoretical argument too, and that I would argue that the real commonality between prisons and factory farms or between uh, political repression and how we treat animals is all about the dehumanizing. You know, when human beings are labeled as animals, it means really bad things are about to happen to them, right? Whether it's Nazi Germany or Rwanda or the American South. When we start calling people of color in particular as animals, and that's how often you hear prison guards, you hear far right people talking about the prison industrial complex, like these are just animals, these are savages. There's a direct relationship between that kind of rhetoric and framing and the systems that are used to continuously dehumanize people and strip animals as well, not just of obviously they're already dehumanized, but strip them of any sense of being worthy of empathy, compassion, or justice.
I'm wondering if you've read Eternal Treblinka by Charles Patterson. That's a great book that touches on these topics.
Yeah, and so over the years, there was Eternal Treblinka, Dreaded Comparison by Marjorie Spiegel, Sexual Politics of Meat by Carol Adams. A lot of kind of brilliant folks have been connecting these dots. And I have to admit, like when I read Eternal Treblinka, I was like, is this appealing to me because I'm already on board with the animal arguments, right? Like, is this something that we're just seeing because we already care about animals? And the more I became immersed in these issues, I do think these systems are that interconnected. I mean, they're the same mindsets, the same strategies, the same tactics, and in some instances, the very same like tools and structures that are used to imprison and control human populations as animal populations.
Yeah, and in fact, that duality is actually what got me very involved in both the topics of animal rights and prison reform. It was reading an article called Meat and the H word being Holocaust, by
Mm.
Nathan J. Robinson of Current Affairs
Oh yeah.
magazine. Is a great article from him. He's not even a vegan, although I think he is a vegetarian. And, he himself says, I mean, and of course, you got to be very careful about how you phrase it, but, comparing our treatment of animals in the Holocaust seems outrageous until you actually start investigating it and realize just how closely those two systems of, well, really mass industrial slaughter and extermination are linked.
And in particular, I'll say outright for folks who are listening who are not vegan or not coming from the animal side of things,
Yeah.
that you hear
Who
that
are a
and it's like,
minority, by the way, but
of your listeners.
nevertheless,
Okay, that's good to
yeah,
know.
but
Um,
nevertheless,
well, I mean, but when you're talking to friends or whoever, I
right,
think you
yeah,
hear that and you're like, oh, those animal rights crazies.
yeah.
They're always trying to like, inflate the issue and make these extreme comparisons to make their point. And to be clear, like, I don't think the comparison is just the scale of violence and suffering,
It's not
as
an
I'm hearing from
equation,
you.
right? Yeah.
Right. It's not saying A equals B. It's saying there's enough similarities with the structures that are used to create A and to create B that we need to look above them. And I think that's what often gets missed here, especially when, to use the farm analogy, social movements get in these silos where we're all so fragmented and isolated. And I know it gets really overwhelming seeing things in this way of like, holy shit, there's similarities between all of these truly egregious abuses of power. But I think that's the path forward.
I think it makes it a lot easier to cope with as well. I mean, I meet a lot of vegans out there whenever they're like, I can't believe that my family members and friends are so evil as to eat meat. But it's, I
Yeah.
do think that we're all locked into really harmful and dangerous consumption patterns, and often, to what degree you can separate yourself with that has a lot to do with your privilege, your education, and it's always better to focus on structural things. And ultimately, yeah, I think it just makes it easier to cope with when you understand that a lot of these issues can be simultaneously tackled intersectionally when we focus on the oppression that's underlies it. That's yeah.
Well, and so one thing I've been thinking a lot about during or after the Third Reich in Nazi Germany, there was a theorist who talked about this idea of the dual state. And what he was arguing was that the way the Third Reich developed is not that immediately the systems of everyday life were destroyed and we just woke up in fascism. It's that there was a parallel system that was created, right? So if you're just a white Anglo German, you still got to go pay your taxes. You go down to the courthouse. You go to work every day. You go to the grocery store or whatever. And then there's this parallel system for those that are designated as Roma or Jew or dissident or whatever. And I think that idea of how these two systems can exist at the same time helps explain what you said a moment ago about so many people just not seeing this or not wanting to see it. And I think there's some lessons there when we're talking about factory farming too. We go to the grocery store when we're hungry, like we get what we need. There's a separate system that is overwhelmingly run by migrants and not native English speakers and kind of impoverished communities that are having to do all of those dirty things to animals and the environment so we can just live in this bubble. And I think that dual state exists both under fascism, as we're seeing right now in the US, but also in some of these other issues like factory farms. I mean, that's how it works.
How has the federal government used Green Scare era tactics against modern social movements during this autocratic administration?
Yeah, I think that's a great point to raise right now that I think a lot of people are not aware of. That the animal rights and environmental movements, as they became the government's number one domestic terrorism threat, this was really the focus post 9/11. There are no other social movements that have been as directly targeted by both state and corporate repression in the name of fighting terrorism as these social movements. And not to say there haven't been tons of other people under attack and repressed in different ways, but I think it's really useful to see that focus because I would argue it's become the playbook. So when I see, for instance, the repression of activists outside of Atlanta with Cop City, right? That started as kind of a forest defense campaign, a community campaign, which I think helps explain in some ways why the tactics that were used against the Cop City protesters are directly ripped from all of the things I've reported on over the years. Using RICO, the Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organizations Act, to go after activists as kind of a criminal enterprise, conspiracy charges, which go further back even to the 60s, but took on a different tone in the post 9/11 complex, post 9/11 state, the surveillance, entrapment, harassment. One thing I do think people should realize too is that this is being spread internationally. And that's something when I wrote Green is the New Red, my first book, I was starting to see, but I think I was a bit naive about how all of that could work. And I think we got to remember that under neoliberalism and global capitalism, um, corporations have no national boundaries, right? So as they pursue their profits, they take a whole suite of tactics with them. And increasingly, those tactics have involved labeling their opposition as eco-terrorists and domestic terrorists and passing nearly identical laws and regulations like we have in the US. So, for instance, with ag-gag laws, which are restrictions on photography of factory farm, those have been passed in Australia and Canada, just copied and pasted. I found evidence when I was in Austria. I talked to lawyers who said FBI agents had come from the US to brief Austrian counterterrorism agents about animal rights activism in the States and how they could shut that down throughout Europe. We're seeing it in Europol reports. So it's important. And again, I know people that are listening to this are already sympathetic, but I try to remind folks when you're talking to people who maybe aren't on board with the environment or animal issues, they still need to care here because these tactics are just being picked up and dropped on other social movements. And I would argue, I'm seeing that right now too with like the rise of ICE. Now, what's important to know about like eco-terrorism, it was state repression. The Green Scare was kind of classic state repression, but it was driven by industry and corporations. And I think that's the model that we're going to see kind of indefinitely moving forward is corporations merging with state power to push like a shared interest. And that's what we're seeing right now is private detention centers. Now we're talking about building more of them. There's a whole industry of tech and Palantir and surveillance that they're directly profiting from this authoritarianism and human rights abuses. And I think to understand the scope of that and how dangerous that is, we have to look at these movements. We have to look at the Green Scare because that's what really set the stage for all of this.
Absolutely. And so your newest book, Little Red Barns, is a deep dive into the animal industrial complex and also explores the relationships between, as we've been discussing, speciesism and fascism and authoritarianism. So, what motivated you to write this book in specific, and what are some of the most interesting things that you learned while writing it?
This started, it wasn't going to be a book. As ag-gag laws were passed, I started doing investigations of factory farms, both on the ground and using drones and aerial surveillance to kind of get around the laws to continue to expose what was happening on these facilities. And the more and more immersed I was in that work, I really started to question whether I was telling the full story. I was getting good shots, I was getting the photos, but as I got just fully immersed in this issue, I felt like we're not seeing communities who were affected, we're not seeing the workers, we're not seeing the broader civil liberties attack. So I was struggling for a number of years with this, of trying to get it to a point of kind of done, that it felt authentic to me. And then that project really changed with the rise of Trump and especially January 6th. And I started to question, like, what is it that's keeping us from seeing how animal rights and environmental activists have been repressed for all of these years, how it set the stage for January 6th and everything that's happening, and nobody is talking about it. So to kind of give the spoiler alert of the book, I realize it's the power of story and narrative. And Little Red Barns, the title of the book, is referring to what we all have been raised on as the story of what agriculture is. And it struck me pretty late in this investigation that it's the exact same story of fascism. You know, it's the happy little, homesteading family with the red barn and the rolling green hills and the American flag, and it's a man and a woman, with their shotgun out front. It's this narrative of when we hear "Make America Great Again," I think it's trying to get us back to this mythological past that never existed. And for folks who don't know, like, that's what fascists have always done. I mean, it's a core to how to how fascists and authoritarians operate. They use these like mythological narratives of a return to power, a return to
A fictional Indo-Aryan heritage that
100%.
Celtic Europeans don't have, or perhaps a great America.
Right. And you can, once you get the archetypes down, you can adapt from Hitler to Mussolini to America quite easily. Okay, shifting the narrative just a little bit about what we're going back to.
Yeah.
And I think we have to see that as the danger. The real danger is that we're a species that depends on stories to make sense of the world. And we also have a really strong confirmation bias. Like, we want to believe what we already think we know. So when we're raised on this image of the little red barn being both the site of animal agriculture and also kind of encoded with values of what it means to be American, boom, that's all these people have to do is tap into that story, and it kind of short circuits our critical thinking.
Yep. So now we have a viewer question from Chelyabinsk in Russia. I think this is like the most international question we've had from my good friend
That's awesome to hear.
Marat. So, how have developments in the field of artificial intelligence affected the work you do,
I
for
appreciate
instance?
that. Murat, I mean, talk about let's add another existential crisis into the mix of fascism and factory farms. And I don't know if AI is quite there yet, but it's disrupting everything. Fundamentally, as a journalist, what's most concerning to me about AI is that I think it's instilling in people a belief that we don't actually have to go do X, Y, or Z ourselves. And you can't tell the truth. You can't be a journalist and hold people in power accountable, all not just from your computer screen, but through this mediated environment and using artificial technology. Of course, I have concerns also about what this means for publishing and people's attention spans and everything combined. But for the purposes of this conversation, what really sticks out is it's kind of reminding me there's a conversation happening right now. I'm hearing in a lot of spaces of animal rights, environmental, that people are concerned both about those consequences, about the environmental impact of AI, but then at the same time, this feeling that like if we don't figure out how to use it, we're going to consistently be at a disadvantage compared to industry and state power, who not only have more people and billions of dollars more, but are also actively using this technology in ways that are far more sophisticated than we are, frankly, to identify targets of repression, to identify targets of bombings and killing, as we're seeing in Gaza. AI is playing a role in that as well. So I think it's kind of a delicate line. I'm not quite sure how to navigate it right now. To be candid, in the last couple months, I've done some like AI courses because like I've approached my work so DIY over the years of like it's pretty much me doing this, and I need to magnify my efforts. Like I can't do all of this by myself. But at the same time, I worry that embracing that technology is kind of putting the nail in the coffin for the type of journalism that I was raised on and that I was grew up believing very deeply in as the way we move forward right now.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for everything that you do, Will. I mean,
I appreciate that.
your books have been a huge inspiration for me and many other activists, both that I know and that I'm sure of. Have, taken so much from your work. It's just been invaluable so much. And thanks so much for coming on the show as well. It's just been an absolute pleasure to host you.
No, it was wonderful talking to you. I appreciate you doing this and sharing these lessons from everybody that you're talking to. I would encourage folks like we have to share these things. Like it can't
Yeah,
just become some like dusty activist or journalist history. Like these are living examples that we need to apply. So I'm grateful for you doing that and for talking to me about it.
all right. Thank you.